Okay, it's time to talk about races in Tales of Maj'Eyal. And I wasn't exactly sure how to frame this, because rating the races just on their power level seems pointless, because the power level of each race is tightly tied to that specific character. So I decided to make 4 tiers, sort of, and how you should understand these is that if you are going to play a class for the first time, you should probably pick a race from these first 2 tiers, where I'll put races with just generally powerful abilities and talents. But this means that absolutely a D super niche race can in certain scenarios be much more powerful than a A-tier race. So I'll try to point out the most powerful talents and the reasons to pick each race, so that you leave this video with a basic understanding of each one, so that you can identify the scenarios in which they are good by yourself. And we start with Cornac, the most bland, basic race. It's the only one that does not have its own race tree, but instead you get an extra class and generic point at the beginning of the game and every 10 levels, and the main selling point, you get an extra category point right at level 1. On some classes this will unlock ways to build a character that are not usually possible by letting you unlock more trees, but generally the extra category point translates to a lot of early power, since you are able to get the extra inscription super early, and then you can either get to 5 inscriptions right on level 10, or start investing in one of the locked trees much earlier than usual, since usually you want to take your 4th inscription on level 10 just to get that extra heal or extra debuff cleanse. This makes Cornac pretty much always good. Higher is the other human subrace, and they are themed around magic, although you do not necessarily need to cast spells or magic for them to be useful. The first talent is Wrath of the Highborn, which instant speed increases all your damage and reduces all damage taken, which means it gives you all resistance. This is just very decent. It's unlikely to be a reason why you pick this race, but it's just a free buff. It's instant speed, and even if you don't go magic, it will provide you some tangible benefit. Overseer of Nations passively gives you some blindness immunity, which is a pretty annoying debuff, and increases your sight range. At level 5 it gives you telepathy, but I think you are very unlikely to ever put 5 points into this talent. The extra sight range is pretty useless on most characters, since you won't have a way to take advantage of that extra sight range, since very few talents can reach that far, and it doesn't even help you spot enemies since you have track, so it's not impressive at first glance. But if you do find some way to make your talents reach over 10 range, this does become very useful. I did this on higher, and it's Dragon Breaths, which can get high range through Adept, and there this was very useful since you can't track all the time, so being able to see what's happening was pretty key. Born into Magic gives you some spell save, which can mostly be ignored, and some arcane resistance, which is one of the less important damage types, but hey, it's still resistance, and it gives you a 20% damage bonus to a damage type when you cast a spell. This again is just nice. You put a single point here and get a bit of a bonus, but not really something you will be picking higher for. The game-changing talent on higher is Highborn's Bloom, which you can activate at instant speed, and it makes all your active talents not use any resources when used. This ability is very similar to Hidden Resources, which is a prodigy, but unlike Hidden Resources, here failure rates still apply. This basically means don't use it with Paradox, which is a resource that increases as you cast spells, and then the higher it is, the more bonuses it gives you, but there is also always a percentage chance for you to fail your talent and instead trigger an anomaly, which gets higher and higher with your Paradox. So Highborn's Bloom in that scenario doesn't really work. The resource where I think this is perfect is Equilibrium, which is a resource that also gets higher and higher as you use your talents, and also gives you a percentage chance to fail your talents the higher it gets, but here there is no benefit for keeping it high, so you can just use Highborn's Bloom at the beginning of combat and get 7 turns of no increases to your equilibrium. Equilibrium is also, in my experience, the hardest resource to manage, so it should make you seriously consider higher. Paradoxically, the equilibrium classes are usually themed around nature powers, so they might not have access to any spells, so Born into Magic can be pretty useless if you can't activate this ability, and that should not make you shy away from higher. If you want an example of where it worked perfectly, you can look at my Vermic video, where I went anti-magic and took higher, and it was absolutely incredible. It was just the race, just the talents that my character needed, so there it was like SS plus tier, but generally I would say higher is niche. Most classes with other resources won't really get that much out of higher. For the elves, we start with Thalore, and these guys are a willpower, nature-themed race who get Gift of the Woods, which is an instant speed, slightly weaker regeneration infusion. And while it might not regenerate as much life, it gives you some heal mod, so if you have other ways of regenerating life, this can be very useful. Unfortunately, it does not stack with a regeneration infusion, so you can't have both of them running at the same time. Then you get Verdant, which passively gives you nature and acid affinity. Affinity makes you heal for a percentage of incoming damage before resistances, so theoretically, with enough affinity, you can heal when enemies attack you instead of taking damage. So it's a great stat, but nature and acid damage are not too frequent, so this is a talent where you just put a single point in it and it won't have much effect on the game. Guardian of the Wood, on the other hand, passively gives you some disease immunity, but also blight resistance, which is a resistance I value pretty highly. It's not a very common damage type, but the enemies that do use it can be pretty dangerous, so it's never a good idea to sleep on your blight resistance. And then you get also all resistance, and getting your resistances high is by far the best way to increase your survivability in Tome. And then the final talent, Nature Sprite, lets you instant speed summon 2 treants for up to 8 turns, which is a long time, and importantly the range to summon them is 4, so they don't need to start right next to you. The resistance depends on your blight resistance, but I've never really focused on this too much, and they were still able to survive a pretty long time. Unlike Gift of the Woods, these guys only scale with willpower, so this talent will feel much worse if you don't take willpower, and then you probably don't want to consider Thalore. But otherwise they are very solid tanks. You do need to be a class that can shoot over friendly targets though. If you are something like an archer and you shoot projectiles, the treants will block it, so there's definitely some anti-synergy there. Ideally you want to be a caster. So Thalore has some pretty good talents, but it lacks that talent that you really want, a reason to pick this race. So I rarely actually end up going for it. The treants are good though, so if you do end up with it, it will never feel too bad, but I'm putting it into B. Shalore is, I think, by a pretty big margin, the most generally powerful race. You will have a hard time beating these talents in a vacuum. Shalore are basically magic elves, but unlike higher, Shalore is actually unplayable if you go anti-magic, as all of its talents are spells, so they will become unusable. You get Grace of the Eternals from level 1, which just gives you a big burst of global speed. This is basically blinding speed, but as a generic talent, notably it doesn't stack with blinding speed, so if your class has access to that, this makes this a little worse, but it's still very good, as if a combat does last more than 5 turns, you can use the other one, and you'll be glad to have it in a boss fight. So Shalore is starting out great. Then you get Magic of the Eternals, which passively gives you crit chance and crit multi, and this is very nice as an option to get you to that 100% crit chance if necessary. Secrets of the Eternals is the forgettable talent. It's a sustain that will sometimes make you invisible, which most enemies will just see through. This is basically useless, but then you get Timeless. And this is one of the most absurd talents in the game, as basically what it reads is remove all your debuffs, reset all your cooldowns, and prolong all buffs on you by 5 turns. So this talent is utterly ridiculous. and a big reason why this class is the best, because any character can use this talent, and it's going to improve your survivability a lot. It's difficult to overstate just how good this is. I do want to mention the experience penalty. This is the first race we are talking about that has an experience penalty, which means you will just level a bit slower. This does have an impact, not because you are not going to hit the maximum level, but because for most classes, perhaps the most dangerous part of the game is tier 2 dungeons until your first prodigy, which will give you a big power boost. With the experience penalty, this part of the game becomes longer, so this is a relevant downside, although it shouldn't really ever make you not pick a race. Also, Shalore has one of the lowest life ratings, which is how much life you get when you level up, and while this is not hugely impactful, it is again, I think, most felt around this same time of early tier 2 dungeons, where having 50, 60, 100 less life than some of these other races can be felt. But despite that, Shalore is still generally agreed to be one of the best races. Doomelf is the demonic elf, and it is the most annoying unlock in the entire game. That doesn't impact its power, but I needed to get it out there. If you want to more know about it, you can look at my Cultists of Entropy video. For its talents, we get the best talent right at the beginning with Haste of the Doomed, which is an instant speed range for teleport. And because it's a teleport, it means it triggers out of phase, which this even gives you some of those basic bonuses just by itself. This scales with willpower, but you don't need to think of Doomelf as a willpower race, since you can get out of phase on your gear, or even just ignore that part. Simply having an instant speed range for teleport is immensely useful and really increases your survivability, especially since you get it from level 0, not from level 24. So this is the biggest strength of Doomelf, is helping you get through that early game with an extra powerful escape talent. Resilience of the Doomed passively reduces the duration of detrimental effects, which I think is pretty useless, since whether you get stunned for 4 turns or 2 turns, you still probably need to cleanse it. So it mostly has impact on all the debuffs that you wouldn't cleanse, which usually means they are pretty negligible. But it also passively reduces the critical multiplier of any critical hits against you, which is pretty good, although you are unlikely to be putting a lot of points here. Corruption of the Doomed is similar to Shalore's sustain, since Doomelf are basically corrupted Shalore in the lore, as far as I understand. But this one is much better, and that's because of this last line of text, where it resets the cooldown of your Haste of the Doomed, the teleport, and Pitiless, which we'll get to shortly. Still, since you will likely have 1 point in this, 21% chance is not too high. And if you deal darkness damage and you are looking to utilize these 2 abilities, I don't think this is really reliable enough to be useful that way. And then Pitiless is inverse timeless, where it increases cooldowns, the duration of all debuffs, and decreases the duration of all buffs on an enemy. And compared to Timeless, this is not very good, but nothing is compared to Timeless. There are some classes like Corruptor, where you can use this to increase the duration of specific important debuffs, but mostly I think it's useful just for stripping buffs from enemies. It is only range 7, but it is instant speed, so this talent is pretty okay. But if you are going Doomelf, I think it is primarily for Haste of the Doomed. I of course also have to mention the Enter Room of Agony. Starting at level 18, you will get an increasing chance to teleport into the Enter Room of Agony when you use your Rod of Recall, which is like a mini dark crypt that you cannot leave. You have to slay the boss of the dungeon to get out, and if you trigger this right around that level 18, 19, 20, it will be the most dangerous zone in the entire game. It can be absolutely brutal, since you will just not have good enough tools to deal with how powerful the enemies are at that point. I've had characters where it actually just felt impossible, especially on weapon classes, where you need to keep up your accuracy with enemy defense. Here the enemies are just scaled so much harder than the rest of the game that you'll have like a 50% chance to hit them, which is just horrible. Obviously, this has an easy solution. You just don't use sort of recall, and you run out of every dungeon, which is very possible if you don't forget. But it's also a little tedious to constantly do that, and I think ideally you should do that until level 25, and after the Prodigy, the zone should be very manageable. So this doesn't really impact the power of the class, race, but if you don't know about it, it will probably kill you. Still, I think, just for the Haste of the Doomed, Doomelf is pretty much always good. Halflings are a cunning-focused race. You get Luck of the Little Folk on level 0, which gives you a massive increase to critical strike chance and saves for 5 turns at instant speed. This is why you need Cunning, as this is one of the most powerful talents on Halfling, and without Cunning it won't be too impressive. You could argue that most of the fights in the game will be over faster than 5 turns, and that is true. Even boss fights on most classes are over pretty quickly, especially if you have a bunch of speed increases, which you usually do. So in theory, you could have only 30-40% critical strike chance and then use Luck of the Little Folk to push you to that 100%. But I don't think this is that good of an idea, since if you are going crit, you will usually also invest either through talents or mostly on your gear into critical strike multiplier. So a lot of your damage will be in those critical strikes. And while most fights take less than 5 turns, some of the most dangerous situations in Tome are when you get surprised. And since this has a massive cooldown, you won't be able to use it again in the same engagement. So at most I think this is good in the early game to boost your damage and start hitting that 100% crit chance much sooner than you would otherwise. Or, since this is a general critical strike chance increase, it can be useful on classes that want to hit hard with physical attacks as well as spells or mind powers. That is a very rare scenario though. Now, something like Demonologist could do it. There are some seeds that make you, kind of like an Arcane Blade, fire spells when you attack with your weapons, and it is much harder to hit a 100% chance on 2 different types of damage, so that could be a niche use for it. The saves are not irrelevant. You might have heard mentioned that saves are a mechanic that you should ignore in Tales of Maj'Eyal, that is basically completely useless. I heavily disagree with that, and what saves do is that they get compared to enemy power when they apply, let's say, a confusion effect on you, and then based on how much of a difference there is between the power and the save, there is a percentage chance that the confusion will apply. If they are equal, it is 50%, and then increases by 5% for each difference. So if you are 19 over, you reach 95% chance to... So if your save is 19 higher than the power, you get the maximum 95% chance to resist the debuff. Unfortunately, that's the cap. You cannot reach 100%, but it is still pretty damn good if you can get it to that level. And you can, even on Insane, it's entirely possible to get your saves to that level. But it requires some investment. Ideally, you want your class to have some increases to saves. Otherwise, just getting it on your gear will be very difficult. With all that being said, if you are focusing on saves, if they are a key part of your defenses, again, getting them temporarily is not really how you want it to work. You want it to be consistent. So, with all that being said, basically what I'm saying, I don't think this talent is all that great. Basically what I'm saying, this talent is okay, but not nearly as powerful as it might seem at first glance. Duck and Dodge passively gives you defense and 50% evasion whenever you take a big hit. This is a nice anti-weapon class enemy talent, since with 50% evasion, it will be very difficult for them to kill you, and you get this just for a single point. Obviously you won't be getting hit for 13% HP all that often, but at the same time, it does happen, so this is nice to have. A Militant Mind gives you power and save increases per enemy in your sight, starting from at least 2 enemies and only up to 5. And I don't think this is very good, since most of the time, since on most classes you will be able to clear out the trash mobs pretty quickly, and you want to do that since even a white mob could apply an annoying debuff to you, so you usually end up in a one-on-one with the actual dangerous enemy, at which point this doesn't have an effect. This talent is at its best in situations like entrances to the Orc Pride, where you will see like 7 enemies. In the vast majority of scenarios, I think this will have a very negligible effect, so I wouldn't invest into this talent. And finally, there is Indomitable, which is an instant speed, stun, daze or pin removal, and then also complete immunity to stuns, dazes and pins for up to 6 turns. This talent I like. Even though you get it at level 24, you might still not have 100% stun immunity at this point. Often I hover at around 60-70% for a while at that point, so this comes in very handy. And even once you do become stun immune, pins are some of the most deceptively dangerous debuffs, since it takes away your most powerful defensive option, running away. And having a button specifically for that effect that you can always press and get rid of any pins does feel pretty good. You could also obviously ignore stun immunity and fully rely on this talent to provide it, but that is extremely dangerous, because if you ever end up in a situation where this talent runs out and you get stunned, you are going to die. With a life rating of 12, Halfling is the baseline tankiest race we've talked about so far, and with all of that added together, I think Halfling deserves B tier. It has generic power that will always be useful, but again I find it lacking of that one super powerful game-changing talent. Now we get to Dwarfs, and Dwarfs are kind of a constitution race, but more importantly, they are the saves race. If you want to really focus on saves, Dwarf is the race for you. They get Resilience of the Dwarfs at level 1, and this is an instant speed buff that scales with Constitution and gives you a bunch of armor, a lot of armor hardiness, and spell and physical saves. I think this talent is pretty good. The armor and armor hardiness will be useful in any fights against weapon classes, which is most of them, and like I've mentioned, temporary saves are not the best if you are really trying to make that one of your primary defensive layers, but thankfully it doesn't end here. And it lasts 8 turns instead of 5, which is a big difference. Stone Skin passively gives you a 15% chance to increase your armor when attacked and to fully ignore the attack triggering this effect. This has no cooldown, so this makes it very difficult for any melee enemy to kill you. This is extremely powerful and very cheap, since you get most of the power of this effect right at the beginning. The armor is nice, but not necessary. Power is money, is how Dwarf actually lets you get these saves permanently, and it just increases all of them based on your gold. You get tons and tons of gold in the game, so this is not really a problem, although the Font of Sacrifice is a pretty good gold thing. Usually you get most of the important crafting done pretty early, and then you waste the last bits of gold on very minor power increases. So there is basically no downside to this. You will get plus 60 saves all the time, which is a huge increase. If you want an example of a class that you could try the saves on, I would say Solipsist. You can pretty easily get extremely high saves, and you'll see how powerful this effect can be. And then Stonewalking lets you walk through a wall, and this is not the only talent in the game that has this sort of effect, and I generally don't like it. It's fine as a sort of last resort option, so you could put a point here, and maybe in a specific scenario it could save your life, but I really don't think this type of effect is very good. So that's Dwarf, a purely defensive race that I think for the most part you should only play with classes that have some sort of save synergy. So I'm going to put it into D super niche, but I'm going to reiterate, this does not mean the race is bad. I really actually think Dwarf is surprisingly powerful in its specific cases, like the Dwarf Solipsist. And now we get to Drem, my favorite race in the game. They look awesome, and they have what I think is the most game-changing talent in the entire game, and that is Frenzy. You get it right from level 1, so you don't need to wait for the fun part of the race until the first prodigy, and it is a very simple talent. It lets you use your class talents twice, which is just generally really good. Any character in the game would be happy to use its best class talent twice. I would be willing to pick this race if all it had is Frenzy. That is how insanely powerful this is. And then the rest is not as impressive. Spike Skin splurges your blood on enemies when you get hit in melee, which deals a tiny bit of darkness damage, but more importantly, it gives you all resistance. So this is alright, and it will be up a surprising amount of time, but it isn't something you can rely on. Then you have Faceless, which gives you a lot of confusion immunity just passively. And these types of talents are great, since you just invest as much as you need out of them. You can definitely max it, or usually you'll have like 3-4 points here, since it scales worse and worse, and you are likely to find some random confusion immunity on at least one piece of your gear. And then from below it devours is a tank kind of that you can summon, and it will draw all enemies towards itself in radius 10. And while I've read some people like this talent and utilize it, I personally have just stopped putting points in it. It costs you a whole turn. It doesn't taunt, right? It just pulls enemies closer. So this one I don't think is that great. But this is perfect, right? You want your worst talent to be your last one at level 24, so that you access all the good stuff as early as possible. On top of this, Drem also has a very good 12 life rating, so this race is just awesome. Really fun, really good, beautiful. So I'll put it right after Shalore. And now we're getting to the races that have some pretty big trade-offs, with great strengths, but also massive weaknesses. And Krog is unique in this regard, because it is a race that is anti-magic by default. So when you start the game, you will have the anti-magic tree, and you cannot use any spells or equip any items with magic modifiers. This already severely limits what kind of character you can play with Krog. All of Krog's talents are pretty damn good, starting with Wrath of the Wilds, which just gives you a guaranteed stun for the first creature hit each turn for 5 turns, which is very, very good. This chance scales with Constitution, but it's mostly irrelevant since you get the 100% for the first creature hit, so you definitely don't need to go Constitution for this talent to just be really good and very cheap for just a single point. Then you get Drake Infused Blood, which gives you a massive amount of stun resistance, almost capping you by itself. And then it also gives you a huge amount of resistance and melee on-hit elemental damage. And the type of elemental damage you can pick and choose. And, 80 is pretty impressive. This does scale with willpower, but since you are anti-magic and you will invest into the anti-magic tree, which also scales with willpower, this is not really a downside. And then the second important part of this is that it lets you use any type of weapon in your offhand, which means you don't need to wield a small dagger or a little mind star, but you can wield a hammer, sword, and these generally have higher damage. This is why this race is often most talked about with classes like Marauder or Mindslayer. Fuel Pain removes your infusion saturation and resets the cooldown of one of your inscriptions if you take a hit of more than 20% of your life, which is going to happen rarely, sometimes, and for a single point, this is a decent ability, but nothing really special. And then Drake Blood Strike deals ridiculously high weapon damage of the chosen element, while also silencing the enemy for 3 turns. So this is also a good talent, but usually this is not something that I personally look for in a race. This is similar to some of the prodigies that give you an attack, like the Wind Blade or the Shot, which are extremely powerful attacks, but there's a big opportunity cost to it where you are not getting the utility that prodigies, or in this case, races usually provide. This doesn't mean the race is bad by any means, but it does mean that the situation in which I even think of Krog as an option are really, really few. And now we get to the undead races, which are the opposite of Krog, since they cannot use any infusions, only runes. And this for me is a much bigger deal, because you lose access to the movement infusion, which hurts more than anything else could in this game, as the movement infusion I think is just invaluable. In exchange for this, the undead races get some pretty impressive bonuses. In Ghoul's case, you become 100% bleed and fear immune, 80% poison immune, and 50% stun immune, just by existing. Those are the default values. And while 3 immunities are definitely welcome, even if they're not the most important statuses, Ghouls also by default only have 80% global speed, which hurts almost as much as the movement infusion. So let's have a look at the talents and see if they can overcome those downsides. The first talent passively gives ghouls strength and constitution, and also makes them never be able to take a blow for more than 50% of your max life. This is kind of one-shot protection, although this does not apply to a turn, this applies to the specific blow. So if there are 5 enemies and one triggers this effect, the other ones can still kill you. And 3 stats are nice. There are a bunch of talents that scale through strength, but you're not getting a lot out of this talent. Then you get Ghoulish Leap, which is a massive range mobility talent that also gives you global speed, and it gives you enough to overcome that innate 20% penalty. But it only lasts for 4 turns, so just with this, you would still often get stuck with 80% global speed. Thankfully, you don't need to rely on this talent for that, so you can just use it for what it is, and that means it's pretty decent. Unfortunately, it is not instant speed, but the huge range makes it very usable, either as an engage or escape option. How you deal with the global speed penalty is through Retch, which makes you vomit on the ground for 10 turns, and standing in that vomit cancels your global speed penalty, while also dealing damage, healing you, and stripping physical effects. This lasting 10 turns really makes the difference, as that should give you more than enough time to deal with most situations, with the only downside being that you are stuck in that specific location, and you can't move around all that much. So this favors you going into melee, since as a ranged character, you usually kite a lot more. And then Gnaw is a melee attack that applies a special disease, dealing blight damage, and if you kill the enemy, they will rise from the dead as a friendly ghoul. So that's all you get. All in all, it's a lot of work to try and keep that 20% global speed reduction not have an effect. So I would only really consider Ghoul on melee classes that deal blight damage, which means exactly Reaver. And even then, there are other very powerful options. So definitely a very niche race. Yeeks are also unique, but in a very different way. They are the only race to have a negative experience penalty, which means they earn more experience, and they also have by far the lowest life rating. Both of these have a very big impact. With the experience increase, you can hit your first prodigy before even going to tier 2 dungeons, at least on Insane, where you get more experience because there are more rares and uniques. But you can also definitely feel that you are a lot squishier. Yeek start with Dominant Will, which lets them mind control an enemy, although anything above rare rank will be entirely invulnerable for the duration, and it only works for 3 turns. So against most enemies, it's basically like a sleep effect, where you use this on them, and then for 3 turns you can rest or create some distance. It is instant speed, although only range 4, and because of the way it works on rare and above monsters, you shouldn't invest more than a single point here, ever. Then you get Unity, which passively gives you Confusion and Silence immunities, which are 2 extremely important immunities. Confusion always, Silence if you are a caster, so this is very powerful. And then you even get a passive increase to global speed, ending up at almost 20% like the Ghoul. And on top of that, you even get a free 1.5 turn when you get really low, giving you that extra opportunity to either kill the enemy or continue running away. So this is also just good. And then Waste is pretty similar to Thalore's Treant summon, where here you instead get 3 Mind Slayers, which can again just tank for you a little bit. And these guys actually deal a decent amount of damage if you do invest into this talent and go willpower. But even if you don't, you just instant speed summon this at the beginning of a fight and you take 3 less hits at the very least. So Yeek is awesome if you can survive. Generally you'll want to combine it with a class that has some strong defensive options to counteract the much smaller life pool. Or for example, I played it with Necromancer, since Necromancer has bonuses for crossing into negative life, which is much easier when you have very little life. So while you definitely cannot play Yeek on every single class in the game, it is powerful enough to warrant consideration on a lot of them. Ogre is the more magically inclined brother of Krog, although thankfully Ogre doesn't have any inscription restrictions. You can use infusions or runes. In fact, it is a race that rewards you for using inscription and makes them more powerful. It gives you the unique ability to wield a two-handed weapon in one hand. So for classes like Sun Paladin that have unique trees for two-handed and one-handed plus shield, on Ogre you could potentially use both of those trees. It starts with Ogric Wrath, which gives you some stun and pinning resistances temporarily and increases your damage by 10% and gives you critical damage multiplier and crit chance in pretty specific conditions. I think this talent is not very good, simply because the stun resistance is pretty much irrelevant since you will want to hit 100% stun immunity anyways. 10% damage done is pretty tiny, and unless you are using an infusion or rune at the beginning of a fight, which sometimes happens, you won't be getting much use out of this, and even if you do, it is just for a single attack, so not much going on with the first talent. But then there is Grisly Constitution, which pretty drastically improves your infusions and runes by having these stats have a bigger effect on them, and then if you put 5 points into this, you'll be able to wield the two-handed weapon in the one hand, with the downside of 20% accuracy and power decrease. This is not to be underestimated, especially the accuracy. On a class like Sun Paladin, which already struggles with accuracy, this can make it very difficult to hit enemies. So I would think of this more as a later game ability, once you can counteract this downside with gear. This is a reason why I don't really like Ogre, because it just doesn't feel good to lose 20% of your accuracy and power. Scar Scripted Flash I do like a lot though. It passively reduces the cooldown of an inscription and of inscription saturation effects by 1 on crit. You don't need a lot of points here. Once you are critting every turn and use some attacks that hit more than once per turn, which is a lot of them, it is not too hard to continuously proc this and just make your inscriptions come off cooldown a lot more often, which is very powerful. And alongside those lines, Writ Large instantly removes Aura Saturations, which is the debuff that increases the cooldown of your inscriptions the more you use them. I should have mentioned that there. And makes your inscriptions cool down twice as fast. And on top of that, it lets you get an extra inscription for 6 of them. But this last ability, I can't imagine where you would ever use this, since that would mean you only unlock a single tree. So for the most part, I think you can ignore this. So I honestly like the inscription abilities the most on Ogre, but at the same time, I don't think those will ever convince me to actually pick Ogre. By far the biggest reason is being able to wield the two-handed weapon in one hand, which opens unique possibilities to build characters that just don't exist normally. So that would put Ogre somewhere in the C tier. And last is the second undead race, Skeleton, which has by far the highest experience penalty at 20%, considerably prolonging that vulnerable period of early tier 2 dungeons before your first prodigy. Its undead bonuses are full immunity to poison, bleed and fear, and since it's a skeleton, it does not need to breathe. And just like the Ghoul, they can only use runes, so no movement inscription. Their first talent passively increases strength and dexterity, And this is much better than strength and constitution, because dexterity is much more useful to weapon classes. And for example, quivers, so bows, scale through strength and dexterity, whereas I don't think any weapon scales through constitution. So this is much more attractive. Bone armor gives you a massive shield. It is not instant speed, but since it lasts for such a long time, you can easily cast this before combat and it will stay up to do its job. Scales with dexterity, which you are already likely to want because of the first ability. This talent is really good. Resilient Bones reduces the duration of detrimental effects on you. So what this actually says, it reduces the duration of effects that you don't care to cleanse usually by a percentage, which then sounds a lot less impressive. So I don't really think this is worth investing into. And then Reassemble is a pretty big heal that also functions as a Blood of Life if you put 5 points into it, letting you resurrect on death. The talent by itself is okay. You ideally want your heals and defensive options to be instant, otherwise you can heal for 700 but take 500 damage in the turn you are using this, in which case you've not helped yourself much. And the ability to resurrect yourself is very expensive for 4 points, and these abilities are worse than they seem, because I would say in like 50 maybe % of scenarios where you die and then you resurrect through Blood of Life or a talent like this, you will just die again. Since you do not get your cooldowns refreshed, you just get your life back, but if you're in a really bad spot, you're just going to die again. So, I don't think this is a reason to pick Skeleton. So what you're left with are the first 2 talents that push you towards a class that really wants more strength and dexterity, and also a huge shield that improves its survivability. And that requirement is not necessarily that niche, but the fact that it is undead definitely does. So I think it firmly belongs next to Skeleton, right at the bottom. I personally definitely play these 2 races the least. You could realistically only ever pick out of these 4 and build really powerful characters. But I think when you do get to use some of these more niche options, it's really satisfying and a lot of fun to explore these options that don't seem as obviously powerful, but can perform just as well. Speaking of that, I am currently playing a Sun Paladin, and I'm honestly pretty surprised at how good the class is. So unless things drastically change, or I die, I might have to apologize to Sun Paladin, because it feels pretty damn good for a melee weapon class. So you can expect a video about that eventually. I'll also make a tier list about inscriptions, since that I think is actually the most interesting topic, as I think my opinion on inscriptions seems to be pretty different from what most of the other experienced players think. So I think that's a fun topic to explore. Thank you for watching.